when Portal was released as a container, there was only one persistent volume needed for a core deployment, which is the one for the WP_profile. But starting in CF192, there are additional options which allow you to store the logs in separate persistent volumes. In this video, I'll be demonstrating the different deployments with different options and discussing persistent volumes needed for an HCL DX Portal Core deployment using 9.5 CF194. Now before we get started, as you can see, I'm using Red Hat OpenShift for this video, but the persistent volume details I'll be sharing in this video will apply to all supported Kubernetes environments. So let's first start out with the storage classes. A storage class contains the provisioner, parameters, and the reclaim policy, which are used when a persistent volume belonging to that class needs to be provisioned. We have a sample storage class in our product documentation here. This is a storage class I'll be using for all the volumes I show you. However, this isn't the only option. Depending on your Kubernetes platform and cloud provider, you'll have different storage classes available to you. You need to decide which one best suits your needs. You can review the official Kubernetes documentation and your cloud-specific documentation for further details. Also, you can navigate to your storage classes in the web UI like seen here, or you can use the kubectl get storage class command. So now that we've discussed storage classes, let's move on to the actual persistent volumes. For a core portal deployment, which is just the portal server and the operator, we'll need 2 to 3 persistent volumes depending on the choices you make in your deployment properties file. The first persistent volume is for the all-important WP_profile directory. If you're using an NFS server, we have a sample in our product doc here. As you can see, it's using the sample storage class as well. One important note here, the access mode needs to include read-write many. If it doesn't, then we won't be able to successfully bind to it. The sample size here is 100 gigabytes, but the minimum is 40. You can choose how large you want this persistent volume to be. So where do we tell our deployment to use this persistent volume for the WP_profile? Let's jump over to my deployment properties file. As I mentioned, I have a couple of deployments. Let's look at deployment A, and we can see the parameters here. The dx.storage class is where I specify the storage class for the WP_profile persistent volume. The dx.volume is the name of the persistent volume I want to use. And the dx.volume.size is the size of the WP_profile persistent volume. Another important note here, if you have a self-provisioning storage class, you can leave the dx.volume parameter blank and the persistent volume should be created automatically for you. The next persistent volume we'll discuss is the logs persistent volume. So as I mentioned before, starting in CF192, you can now store your logs in a separate persistent volume. So if I scroll down in our properties file, we'll see these parameters here. If dx.splitLogging is set to true, the log files like the systemout.log and the trace.log will be stored in a separate persistent volume. If this is set to false, they'll be stored in the WP_profile persistent volume. Besides setting this parameter to either true or false, we also can set the reclaim policy under the dx.logging.reclaim parameter and the storage class under the dx.logging.stg class, as well as the size in the dx.logging.size. But if you notice, there is nowhere to specify the name of persistent volume. That's because this persistent volume will either be automatically created for you if you have a self-provisioning storage class, or it'll use one of the available persistent volumes in your cluster. If you don't have a self-provisioning storage class, you need to create these beforehand, and you need to make sure that the storage class matches and the access mode includes read-write once. The last persistent volume I want to discuss in this video is the one for transaction logging. This persistent volume will always be needed. there's no parameter where you can specify either true or false for this one. The important note on this is as of CF194, it will use the same storage class, size, and reclaim policy set for the DX.split logging. So even if you set DX split logging to false, you will still need to update the other properties since they will be used for the transaction logging persistent volume. And like the logs persistent volume, this one does not have a place to specify the name of the volume. So it'll get either automatically created for you, or you'll have to create it beforehand and make sure that the storage class matches and also that it includes access mode read-write once. So let's see what this looks like in our web console. In my deployment A, I have split logging set to true. In my deployment B, I have split logging set to false. So in my deployment A, we can see the pods and we can see the core and the operator pod running. Now, if we look at my persistent volumes, you'll see I have a lot of different volumes. So to make things easier, I'll switch over to my persistent volume claims view for this project. And here we can see 3 persistent volumes as expected, one for the WP_profile, one for the logs, and one for the transaction logs. Now let's switch over to deployment B. Since I have split logging set to false, there are only 2 persistent volumes in this deployment, one for the WP_profile and one for the transaction logs. Now let's complicate things a little further. Remember the access mode on the logging persistent volumes are set to read-write once. So what happens when you have multiple core pods? Well, I happen to have another DX deployment on this cluster. This one has digital asset management and content composer deployed, so you just have to ignore these extra pods. But as you can see, there's 2 core pods running. And if I jump over to my persistent volume claims, again, ignore the DAM-1 and the PV0002 volumes, since those are for digital asset management. But for the core deployment, we have 1 WP_profile persistent volume and 2 of both the logs and the transaction logs persistent volumes. And this is because each core pod will have its own logs and its own transaction logs persistent volume. And if this wasn't clear, I do have split logging enabled, and that's why we have 2 log persistent volumes for this deployment. One last note before wrapping this up. I just described how persistent volumes for the core pods are currently working in CF194. But as fast as container technologies are moving, sometimes it's hard to keep up. So be sure to check out the What's New product documentation page whenever a newer container CF is released for any future changes.